Okay, I'm going to record the second part of the last voyage we left off from Star Diaries, where Ian T. Hill was sent to the planet of supposedly robots. I'm going to leave this in audio only simply because, it's better quality and also I can't be bothered to look presentable, among other things. In any case, um, the officer looked us over front and back and ordered us to hold our halberds higher. Fie, ye are sluggardly clunks, net halberdier of his inductivity. Strengthen those ranks, shoulders out, hep hep. The halberdiers submitted to this inspection without comment. Then on the trudged beneath the noonday sun, as I cursed the hour that I had volunteered to set out for this miserable planet. In addition, I was famished. A rumbling stomach could easily betray me, so I tried rattling as loudly as I could. We passed a restaurant. I looked inside. Practically all the tables were occupied. Magnificants, or rather clunks, as I called them in my thoughts, remembering the officer's words, sat there motionless, enameled blue, though now and then one of them would squeak or turn its head to gaze glass-eyed out on the street. They ate nothing, drank nothing, but seemed only to be waiting, for what I could not guess. The waiter, recognizable by the white apron it wore over its armor, was standing by the wall. "Perchance we two would sit in yonder?" I asked, for I could feel every blister on my iron-bound feet. "In sooth thou art a silly fallawe," huffed my companions. "Switch luxury nace for the likes of us, nay, stodging the most remelian away. But fair enough, thus there do lay in wait for some mucilid to entreken, wham he come and requiring a soupe or a growel, his fingly nature there be reveal." Not understanding any of this, I plodded on obediently. After a while, though, I began to grow desperate. However, we headed at last toward the great building of red brick, on which a wrought iron inscription was visible. "Ye barracks of the halberdiers of his mighty inductivity, calculum the first." I broke away from my companions at the very entrance. The halberd I left with the sentinel as it turned its back with a clank and a clang, then ducked into a first side street. Around the corner there stood a sizable building with the signboard "Under the Axe." I only peered inside, but the innkeeper, a pot-bellied robot with short legs and creaking eagerly, hopped out on the street. "Well met, my liege, well met. Humbly at your service. Will ye be a craving brown, mayhap?" "Yes," I answered laconically. He practically bore me bodily inside. Leading the way up the stairs, my host prattled on in his tinny voice like the possessed. "No end of peregrinators are hinderward. Ye come of late, no end. There is not a magnificant, I trow, who ne desireth hem to look upon the coronation of the incandescent filaments of our inductivity with his own tway lenses. This way, an please your lordship, a worthy apartmentum, after ye prithee. Here in the parlour, there the den, but doubtless your grace must be for weary. Hey, the dust heat grindeth in thy gears. By your leave, I fetch some ablutements anon." He went clattering down the stairs, and before I had much chance to look around for that rather dismal room, furnished as it was with an iron chest of drawers and an equally iron bed, he returned with an oil can, a rag, and a bottle of silicone. Placing these on the table, he said in a lower, more confidential tone, "When ye have yourselves a mite refreshment, sire, pray betake you down stairs. For genteel folk like your honour, I'll ways keep a little scretum, something sweet and savoury, shall daily well." And out he went, winking his photocells. Having nothing better to do, I oiled myself, polished my plates with the silicone, and noticed that the innkeeper had left on the table a card which seemed to resemble a restaurant menu. Well aware that robots never eat, I picked up surprised and read Birdle Second Class across the top. Mucilit infant decapitatus, 8 pist. The same with goo, 10 pist. The same with pinga, 11 pist. The same piteous, 14 pist. Liftstock, cutlet de sodomy itch, 6 pist. Mary chop, 8 pist. The same calf Mickey and delicate, 8 pist. None of it made sense to me, but my blood ran cold when from the adjoining room I heard the crashing of incredible violence, as if some robot were there endeavoring to dash his lodgings into splinters against the wall. My hair stood on end. I'd had enough. Trying not to cling or clang, I fled from that dreadful den out into the street, breathing easily only when I'd put a good distance behind me. And now, what was I, poor wretch, to do? I stopped by a group of robots playing Old Maid and pretended to be an enthusiastic onlooker. It was still a complete mystery to me as to what these magnificents actually did. I could probably sneak past into the ranks of the halberdiers, but that did not promise much if the chance of being caught that was considerable. What then? Racking my brains in this manner, I walked along until I noticed a portly robot seated on a bench and warming his old rivets in the sun. He had covered his head with a newspaper. On the first page I saw a poem that began with the words, "A degenerate am I, fro magnifica I high." What came next I don't recall. Gradually we struck up a conversation. I introduced myself as a stranger from the neighboring town of Sadomasia. The old robot was exceedingly cordial. Almost at once he invited me to his home. "Lo, and wherefore shouldst thou, worthy sir, go knocking about the taverns, in which wise be obliging eke to biker with herbergers and their sort? Pray come with me, vouchsafe the honour my humble roof, have thy goodness partake the gramercy. Bliss entereth with your esteemed person into my lowlysome abode." What could I do? I agreed, of course. It even suited my purpose. My new host had his own house on 3rd Street. He immediately showed me to my room. "Fro the road, hast doubtless much old dusty sovelled," he said. Again, out came the oil can, the silicone, and the rag. I knew already what he would say, robots being such uncomplicated creatures. And sure enough, "When ye are a mite refreshened, pray take yo to the parlour," said he, "and we shall play in some todgere party." He closed the door. I didn't touch the oil can or the silicone, but only examined the condition of my makeup in the mirror, blackened my teeth, and after some quarter of an hour decided to go downstairs, though I was not a little apprehensive about the prospect of the mysterious playing, when suddenly from the depths of the house long and drawn-out rumblings reached my ears. This time, however, there was no escape. Down the stairs I went, fanned by the racket as though someone were hewing an iron stump to slivers. It came from parlour. My host, stripped down to his iron torso, was, with a curiously fashioned cleaver, hacking away at a large doll that lay upon the table. "Entre, good my guest, ye mut werken your heart's delight upon yon carcass," he said, leaving off his chopping when he saw me and pointing to another somewhat smaller doll lying there on the floor. When I drew near, the thing sat up, opened its eyes, and began in a faint voice to say over and over, "Sire, I ain't an innocent child, spare me! Sire, I am an innocent child, spare me!" My host handed me an axe, similar to a halberd, but with a shorter shaft. "Now, then, noble guest, away with care, away with sorrow, have to, and smite smert." "But I do not cure for children," I feebly protested. He froze. "No cure?" he repeated. "Ah, pity, ye putten me in sore perplexity, my friend. What shall you do? I have but little ones, 'tis my weakness, you see. Wouldst thou try a calf?" And from out the cupboard he brought a perfectly serviceable plastic calf, which, when squeezed, produced a timorous bleat. What could I do? Not wishing to unmask myself, I slashed away at the unfortunate puppet, tiring myself out completely in the process. Meanwhile, my host had drawn and quartered both dolls, put aside his instruments, which he called his bone-buster, and asked me if I was content. I assured him that I had not known such pleasure for quite some time. And so began my cheerless life on Cercia. The next morning, after a breakfast that consisted of hot mineral oil, my host left for work, while his wife sawed at something furiously in the bedroom. A baby calf, I think, but I wouldn't swear on it. Unable to any longer take the bleating, the screaming, the constant clamor, I went out and walked about the city. The way its inhabitants spent the time was fairly monotonous. Quartering, breaking on the wheel, burning, dissevering. At the center town was an amusement park with pavilions, where one could buy most ingenious instruments. After a few days of this, I couldn't even look at my own penknife, and only driven by hunger would I venture out beyond the city at dusk to hide in the bushes and hurriedly cram down sardines and biscuits. Little wonder that on such a diet I was always within a hairbreadth of the hiccups which would have placed me in a mortal danger. On the third day, I went to the theatre. They were putting on a play called Carbazarius. It was about a handsome young robot mercilessly persecuted by man, that is, by mucilids, who doused him with water, sprinkled sand in his oil, loosened his screws so that he kept falling down, etc. The audience clanged angrily. In the second act, an emissary of the computer appeared and the young robot was freed, and in the third act dealt at length with the fate of man, which, as one might imagine, was not particularly pleasant. Out of boredom, I went poking through my host's private library, but out there was nothing of interest. A few cheap reprints of Marquis de Sade's memoirs. Beyond that, nothing but pamphlets, items like How to Recognize a Mucilid, of which I memorized a couple passages. A mucilid, the text began, is very soft, in consistency similar to a dumpling. Its eyes are opaque, watery, a tray image of this soulless abomination. The cheeks are rubbery, and so on for nearly 100 pages. Saturday, we were visited by town notables, the master tinker of a tinsmith guild, a deputy municipal armourer, a senior guildsmith, two protocrats, one grand mason. Unfortunately, I was unable to figure out what sort of occupation these were, since the talk mainly was of art, the theatre, and the wonderful all-functionality of his inductivity. The ladies gossiped a little. From them I learned that a certain Copsidon, a notorious rake and a scapegrace, who in the upper circles led a life of reckless dissipation, had surrounded himself with a bevy of electrical bacchantes, showering upon them the most expensive tubes and fuses imaginable. But my host did not seem particularly indignant when I mentioned this Copsidon. "Young current must have its course," he said good-humouredly. "When he groweth rusty and his resistors begin to fizzle, he shall clink another tune." One female magnificent who hardly ever dropped in on us for some unknown reason took a shine to me, and once, after downing Lord knows how many mugs of mineral oil, whispered, "Thou art cute. Wilt have me? Let us hie to my house, or selven therefore to uphooken." I pretended to have sudden cathode discharge had made it impossible for me to hear her words. My host and hostess generally got along well together, but once I was involuntary witness to a quarrel. She shouted something about his going to scrap, to which he, the husband, made no reply. We were also visited from time to time by a much sought-after master electrician who ran a clinic in the city. It was from him that I learned, for he did, though rarely, speak about his patients, that robots do on occasion go mad, and that the most serious of the persecution manias is in the conviction that one is a man. Moreover, as I gathered from his words, though he never actually came out and said it, there had been a significant increase in number of such cases as late. I did not, however, relay those bits of information to Earth because, first, they seemed too trivial, and secondly, I wasn't particularly eager to go marching back over to the mountains where I'd left my rocket, which held the transmitter. One fine morning, just as I was finishing my calf, my host supplied me with one each evening, convinced that nothing in the world could give me greater pleasure, the entire house reverberated to a violent banging at the gate. My fears, it turned out, were only too well justified. It was the police, that is, the halberdiers. They placed me under arrest and without a single word led me out on the street before the eyes of my petrified host and hostess. I was shackled, put into a van, and driven off to prison, where a hostile crowd already stood at the entrance, hissing and booing. They locked me in a separate cell. When the door was slammed shut behind me, I sat on my metal mattress with a loud sigh. A sigh couldn't hurt me now. For a while, I tried to figure out how many prisons it had been now in which I'd sat in various regions of the galaxy, but I kept losing count. Something was lying at the foot of the mattress. A pamphlet on the detection of mucilids. Had it been put there maliciously to mock me? I opened it without thinking. First I read about how the upper portion of the mucilid trunks moves in conjunction with the so-called phenomenon of breathing, and how one can determine whether the hand extended in greeting is doughy, and if from the facial opening there isn't a slight breeze. When agitated, the passage concluded, the mucilid secretes a watery fluid, mainly through the forehead. It was accurate enough. I was indeed secreting that watery fluid. On the face of it, cosmic exploration does seem a bit repetitious, viz., those above mentioned, and perpetually recurring, as if they represented an unavoidable aspect of the Enterprise. Sojourns in jail, whether interstellar, planetary, or even nebular, but with my situation had never been so dismal as now. Around noon, a guard brought me a bowl of warmed-over mineral oil, in which there floated a few ball bearings. I asked for something more nourishing, inasmuch as I had already been unmasked, but he only clinked ironically, and left without a word. I began to pound the door, demanding a lawyer. No one answered. Towards the evening, when I had eaten the last crumb of a biscuit, I discovered, inside my armor, a key scraped in the lock, and into the cell walked a squat automaton with a thick-letter briefcase. "Course ye be mucilid," he said, and then added, "I am your defender." "Do you always greet your clients in this manner?" I asked, taking a seat. He also sat, clattering. He was hideous. The plates across his abdomen had worked completely loose. "Mucilids, aye," he said with conviction. "'Tis only out of loyalty to my profession, not to you, ye shameless fiend, that I exercise my skills in your defence, creature. Preventure the punishment that avoided can be lightened to but a single dismangle in ye." "What are you talking about?" I said. "I can't be dismantled." "Ha!" he creaked. "This is what you think. And now tell me what ye have hid up your sleeve, O evil slime." "Your name?" I asked. "Clostron Fredrax." "Tell me, Clostron Fredrax, what am I accused of?" "Of mucilidity," he replied at once, "a capital offence, and also of intent to work and treason upon us, of espaliment on behalf of Gookum, of blasphemous conspiracy to lift and hand against his inductivity. Do that suffice, excrescent mucilid. Confess to your death crimes." "Are you really my lawyer?" I asked. "For you speak little like a prosecutor or examining magistrate." "I am your defender." "Good. I confess to none of the above crimes." "The sparks, they shall fly," he roared. Seeing the kind of defender they've given me, I kept silent. The next day I was brought out and interrogated. I admitted nothing, though the judge thundered even more terribly, if that was possible, than my lawyer on the day before. Now he would roar, now whisper, but now burst into metallic laughter, and again calmly explain that sooner would he start to breathe than I escape the magnificent justice. At the next interrogation there was present some important dignitary, judging by the number of tubes that glowed inside him. 4 more days went by. My biggest problem was food. I made do with the belt from my trousers, soaking it in the water they brought me once a day. The guard carried the pot at arm's length as if it were poison. After a week the belt ran out, but fortunately I had on high-laced boots of goatskin. Their tongues were the very best thing I ate during my stay in the cell. On the 8th day, at dawn, 2 guards ordered me to collect my things. I was placed inside a van and transported with an escort to the Iron Palace, the residence of the Computer. Up magnificent rust-proof upstairs we went, through holes lined with cathode tubes, and I was ushered into an enormous windowless room. The guards retired, leaving me alone. In the middle of the room was a black curtain that hung from the ceiling to floor, its folds enclosing at the center and arranged in the shape of a square. "Oh, wretched mucilid!" boomed a voice, coming if through pipes from an iron vault. "Your final hour draws nigh. Speak, what is your pleasure, the flesh shredder, the bone buster, or the hydraulic punch?" I was silent. The computer clanged and rumbled, then cried, "Hearken to me, mucilaginous monstrosity! Hitherward come, at the behest of all Gookum kind. Hearken to my mighty voice, thou pollen cordulum, thou snivelous emulsion! In the magnificence of my illuminating current I bestow upon thee mercy. If thou wilt join the ranks of my devoted minions, if thou wilt thy heart and soul wouldst be a magnifican, I may possibly spare thee thy life." I said that this very thing had been my fondest dream for years. The computer chuckled, posing with derision, and said, "I know thou liest, but hear me, O maggot. Thou mayst continue thy gluttonous existence only as an undercover magnificent halbardier. Thy task will be all mucilid, spice, agents, traitors, and such other viscous vermin are sent from Gook to unmask, expose, lay bare, and brand with the white iron, for only through such loyal service canst thou hope to save thy sticky skin." When I had solemnly sworn to everything, they led me to another room, where I was entered in the registry and ordered to submit daily reports at the central halbardieri, after which, feeling weak and numb, I was permitted to leave the palace. Night was falling. I went outside the city, sat on the grass, and began to think. I was sick at heart. Had they cut off my head, I would at least have saved my honor, but now, by going over to their side of that electronic monster, I betrayed the cause I represented. I'd ruined my chances completely. What then? Run off to the rocket? A shameful retreat. But all the same, I started walking. To be an informer in the employ of a machine that ruled an army of iron crates, that would have been more shameful yet. Who can describe my horror when, instead of the rocket in the place I'd left it, I saw only the scattered remains, broken fragments, clearly the work of robots. It was dark when I returned to the city. I sat on a stone and for the first time in my life wept bitterly for my home, lost forever, and the tears trickled down the iron interior of that hollow hulk which was to be, for the remainder of my days, my prison, and they trickled out through the knee chinks, threatening to stiffen the joints with rust. But I no longer cared. Then suddenly I noticed a platoon of halbardiers, slowly wending its way toward the meadow at the edge of the city, outlined against the last glimmer of the setting sun. Their behavior was peculiar. In the growing darkness of the evening, first one, then another, separated himself from the ranks, and, moving his feet as quietly as possible, crept into the bushes and disappeared. This struck me as so odd that in spite of my extreme depression, I got up quietly and set off after the one nearest me. This was, I must add, at the time when the local shrubbery was bearing wild berries similar in taste to whortleberries, sweet and full of flavor. I'd eaten them myself, whenever, that is, I was able to slip away from the iron metropolis. Picture my astonishment upon seeing the halbardier I'd been following pull out a tiny key, the exact duplicate of the one given to me by the director of division headquarters, and use it to unfasten his visor from the left side, then, grabbing berries with both hands, stuff them into that open pit like a savage. Even from where I stood I could hear the sounds of slurping and gulping. "Psst!" I hissed urgently. "Hey!" With a single bound he went crashing into the underbrush, but didn't get far, or else I would have heard him. He had fallen down somewhere. "Listen," I said in a lower voice. "Don't be afraid. I'm a man, disguised like yourself." Something like a single eye, glittering with fear and suspicion, peered at me from behind a leaf. And how would I ye not be bearing? Came a hoarse voice. But I'm trying to tell you I came from Earth. They sent me specially. I had to persuade him a while before he was reassured enough to crawl out of the bushes. He touched my armor in the darkness. You're a man, forsooth? Why won't you talk normally? I asked. Tush, I have forgotten how. 'Tis the 50 years since the cruel destiny had delivered me hither. Much I have suffered, more than I can tell. Fortune is merciful to let me clap mine ye upon a very mucilid afore I die. He babbled. Pull yourself together. Enough of that. Listen, you're not by any chance from intelligence. Certain fro intelligence. 'Twas Mallingrout did send me here for the swinke and swelt them most grievously. But why didn't you flee? Pray how I am to flee, and my rocket to be dismantled, and ik to shivered and flindren? Alas, and waylaid hard is my lot, but 'tis time I return. Shall we see each other again? At barracks, 2 more. Wilt thou not come? I agreed to meet him then, without even knowing what he looked like, and said goodbye, cautioning me to wait there for a while yet. He disappeared into the blackness of the night. It was with a light heart that I re-entered the city, for now I saw the chance of organizing a conspiracy. In order to conserve my strength, I stopped at the first inn that presented itself along the way and went to bed. Early next morning, while looking in the mirror, I noticed a chalk mark on my chest, a tiny cross, right below the left pauldron, and suddenly the scales fell from my eyes. That man! He had done this, intending to betray me. The no-good skunk! I muttered, frantically trying to think what to do now. I wiped away the treacherous sign, but that wasn't enough. He'd already made his report. I was sure of that, and they would start looking for this unknown mucilid, and obviously turn first to their registers and call the most likely suspects in for questioning. I was there, of course, on that list. The thought of being questioned made me shudder. I realized that somehow I had to divert suspicion from myself, and immediately hit upon a plan. All that day I stayed at the inn, abusing a cough in order to remain inconspicuous, but at dusk I quickly set out for the center of town, concealing in the palm of my hand a piece of chalk. With it I inscribed at least 400 crosses on the iron hides of various passerbys. Whoever I chanced to come my way received the mark. At about midnight, feeling somewhat easier in my mind, I returned to the tavern, and only then it did occur to me that, besides the traitor with whom I had spoken the night before, there had been other halberdiers creeping into those bushes. This made me stop and think. Then all at once, an amazingly simple idea came to me. I left the city and headed for the berries. It was a little after midnight when once again that iron rubble appeared, slowly spread out, scattered, and then from the nearby thickets came sounds of heavy breathing, furious chewing, hurried swallowing. Afterwards the visors were one by one snapped shut, and the entire company climbed out of the bushes in silence, stuffed to the gills with berries. I approached them. In the darkness they took me for one of their own, and as we marched along, chalked little circles on my neighbours wherever I could. At the gates of the halberdieri I did about face and went back to the inn. The following day I sat myself down on a bench outside the barracks and waited for those on furlough to come out. Having spotted in the crowd one of the ones with a circle on the shoulder, I took after him, and when there was no one in the streets but us, I clapped him on the back with my gauntlet, so that he rang from head to toe, and said, "In the name of his inductivity, come with me." So frightened was he that he started clattering all over, and followed me without a word, as docile as a lamb. I closed the door to my room, pulled the screwdriver from my pocket, and began unfastening his head. This took an hour. I lifted off like an iron pot, and was confronted by a face unpleasantly pallid from being in the dark for too long, thin and wall-eyed with fear. "Ye're mucilid," I snarled. "Yes, sir, your worship, but—" "But what?" That is, I am registered. I swore allegiance to his inductivity." "How long ago? Speak." Three year ago, sir. But, wherefore dost thou—" "Hold," I said. "And do you know of any other mucilids?" "On earth? Yea, sooth to say, I do, your grace. I cry for your mercy. 'Twas only— Not on earth, fool, here. Nay, no, sir, lo. But if ever I see one, straight not shall I notify thee. All right, I said. You may go. Here, put your head back on. And tossing him the screws, I pushed him out of the door, where I could hear him trying to don his metal skull with trembling hands. Then I sat on my bed, greatly surprised by this turn of events. All that next week there was plenty of work to be done, for I pulled individuals of the street at random, took them to the inn, and there unscrewed their heads. My hunch was right. They were all of them men, every last one. Not a single robot in the lot. Gradually an apocalyptic image took shape before my eyes. A demon, an electrical demon, that computer. What hell had hatched there in its nest of glowing wires? The planet was wet, humid, rheumatic, and for robots unhealthy in the highest degree. They must have rusted en masse, and perhaps, too, there was, as the years passed, an increasing lack of spare parts, and they began to break down, going one by one to the vast cemetery outside the town, where only the wind rang their death knell over sheets of crumbling metal. That was when the computer, seeing its ranks melt away, seeing its reign endangered, had conceived the most ingenious machination. From its enemies, from the spies dispatched to destroy it, it began to build its own army, its own agents, its own people. Not one of those who were unmasked could betray it. Not one of them dared to attempt to contact other men, having no way of knowing that they weren't robots. And even if he did find out about this one, or that he'd been afraid that the first overture, the other man would turn him in. Just as that first bogus halberdier tried to do, the one I'd caught off guard with the whortleberry bushes. But the computer wasn't satisfied merely to neutralize its enemies. It made of each a champion of its own cause, and by requiring them to turn others in, the new arrivals, this gave still further proof of its diabolical cunning, for who could best distinguish men from robots if not those very men, who after all were privy to all the secrets of the intelligence? And so, each man unmasked, included in the register, had sworn in, felt himself isolated, and possibly even feared his own kind more than the robots, for the robots were not necessarily agents of the secret police, while the men were, to a man. And that was how this electrical monster kept us in slavery, foiling everyone, with everyone else, for it must have been my own companions in misery who had taken apart my rocket as they hadn't done, judging by the halberdier's words, with scores of other rockets. Infernal, infernal, I thought, quivering with rage. And it wasn't enough that it drove us to treachery, that the division itself sent more and more of us to serve the thing's pleasure. Earth was also supplying it with the very finest, rust-proof, top-quality equipment. Were there any robots left among those ironclad minions? I seriously doubted it. And the zeal with which they persecuted men, that too became clear, for being men themselves, they had to be, as neophytes to magnificanism, more robot-like than the authentic robots. Hence that fanatical hatred displayed by my lawyer. Hence that dastardly attempt to turn me in by the man I had first unmasked. Oh, what fiendishness of coils and circuitry was here! What electrical finesse! Revealing the secret would get me nowhere. At the command from the computer I would unquestionably be thrown in the dungeon. Now, the people had been obedient too long. For too long had they feigned devotion to that plugged-in Beelzebub. Why, they'd even forgotten how to talk properly. What then could I do? Sneak into the palace? That would be madness. But what remained? An uncanny situation. Here was a city surrounded by cemeteries, in which the computer's subjects lay, long since turned to rust, yet it reigned on, stronger than ever, and confident, for Earth kept sending it more and more new men. Idiotic! The longer I thought about it, the more clearly I saw that even this discovery, which certainly must have been made before by more than one of us, didn't change things in the least. A single individual could do nothing. He would have to confide in someone, trust someone, but that inevitably resulted in an instant betrayal, the traitor counting on a promotion, on getting into the good graces of the machine. By Saint Electrics, I thought, it is a very genius, and thinking this, noticed that I too was already affecting a slightly archaic mode of speech, that I too had caught that contagion by which the sight of iron hoods come to seem natural, and a human face, something naked, ugly, indecent, mucilagynous. Good Lord, I'm going insane, I thought. And the others, they must have turned lunatic years ago. Help! After a night spent in gloomy meditation, I betook myself to a store downtown, paid 30 pistons for the sharpest cleaver I could find, waited for the darkness to fall, then stole inside the great garden that surrounded the palace of the computer. There, hidden in the shrubs, I freed myself of my iron armor, and with the aid of a pair of pliers and a screwdriver, and on the tiptoe, barefoot without sound, I shinnied up the rainspout to the second floor. The window was open. Along the corridor, clanking hollowly, a guard was walking back and forth. When he turned his back to the opposite end of the hall, I jumped inside quickly and ran to the closest door and entered quietly, unnoticed. This happened to be the same large room in which I'd heard the voice of the computer. It was dark. I pulled aside the black curtain and saw the tremendous roof-high wall of the computer with dials shining like eyes. At the edge of the white chink was visible, apparently, a door left ajar. I approached on a tiptoe and held my breath. The interior of the computer looked like a small room in a second-class hotel. In the back stood a half-open safe, not very large, a cluster of keys hanging from its lock. At a desk piled high with papers sat an elderly, dried-up gentleman in a grey suit, with baggy sleevelets, the kind worn by office clerks. He was writing, filing out the page after page of forms. There was a cup of coffee steaming at his elbow. A few crackers lay in the saucer. I tiptoed in, closed the door behind me. The hinges didn't squeak. "Ahem!" I said, lifting the cleaver with both hands. The gentleman started and looked at me. The gleam of the cleaver in my hands produced in him the utmost consternation. His face twisted, he fell to his knees. "No!" he groaned. "No!" "Raise your voice once more, and you perish," I said. "Who are you?" "Heptagonius Arguson, my lord." "I'm not your lord. You will address me as Mr. Teeth, understand?" "Yes, sir, yes. Where is the computer?" "Mr. There isn't any computer, is there?" No, sir. I was only following orders." "Of course. And from whom, one might ask?" He trembled like a leaf. He lifted his hands in entreaty. "There'll be such trouble," he groaned. "Please, don't make me tell you. Forgive me, Mr. Tiche. I'm only a secretary grade 6 on the payroll." "Come now. And the computer, and the robots?" "Mr. Tiche, have mercy. I'll tell you the whole truth. Our chief, he organized it. Funds were allocated to expand operations to increase efficiency in research and development, determining the fitness of our people, but the main thing was the allocations." "You mean this was faked, all of it?" "I don't know, I swear I don't. From the time I got here, nothing's changed. You mustn't think that I'm in charge here, God forbid. My job is only to maintain these personal files. The question was whether our people would break down in the face of enemy in a critical situation, or whether they were ready, you see, to fight to the death." "And why has no one returned to Earth?" Because they all turned traitor, Mr. Tiche. As yet not a single one has been willing to lay down his life for the cause of Gukum. For our cause. I meant to say it out of habit that I use that word. Please try to understand. 11 years sitting here, and in just one more I'm up for retirement, a pension. I have a wife and child, Mr. Tiche, so for the love of— "Silence!" I said angrily. "You want a pension, dog? I'll give you a pension." I raised the cleaver. The clerk's eyes bulged. He began to grovel at my feet. I ordered him to stand. Making certain that the safe had a small grated opening for ventilation, I locked him up inside. "And not a peep out of you. And if there is any knocking or thumping, villain, it'll be flesh shredder." The rest was simple. That night was not among the most pleasant I had ever spent, for there were papers to look through, reports, statements, affidavits, record dossiers, Each inhabitant of the planet has his own portfolio. Using all the most confidential documents, I made myself a bed on the desk there, being placed no place to sleep. In the morning, I switched on the microphone and, as the computer, gave the order for the entire populace to assemble in front of the palace. Everyone was to bring with him a pair of pliers and a screwdriver. When they all had lined up, like a giant chessman made of iron, I ordered them to unscrew each other's heads, on behalf of the capacitance of Saint Electrics. At 11 o'clock, the first human head began to show, and there was tumult and confusion, cries of "Treason! Treason!" which, a few minutes later, when the last iron ball had clattered to pavement, merged into a single roar of joy. I then appeared on my own identity and suggested that, under my direction, they all get down to work, for I wished to put together, out of the raw materials and supplies at hand, a great ship. It turned out, however, that in the palace cellars there were already a great number of cosmic ships, and with full tanks ready to go. Before takeoff, I left Argison out of the safe, but didn't take him on board, nor would I permit anyone else to. I told him that I intended to inform his chief of everything, and also to let latter know, in no less detail, exactly what I thought of him. Thus concluded one of the most unusual of my adventures and voyages. Notwithstanding all the hardship and pain it had occasioned me, I was glad of the outcome, since it had restored my faith, shaken by corrupt cosmic officeholder, in the natural decency of electronic brains. Yes, it's comforting to know, when you think about it, that only a man can be a bastard.